If you're watching this, I can say two things about you with almost absolute certainty. Firstly, you're wondering why a show about video games is on a YouTube channel called FilmJoy, and secondly, you like video games. You've probably liked video games for most of your life, which means there will be games you remember from your childhood that are important to you, that have stayed with you for a long time. Maybe it's a classic that everybody has played, or maybe it's a game you didn't fully understand as a kid but grew to love and appreciate as you got older. Maybe it's a game nobody but you remembers, or maybe it's just a crappy licensed game based on a cartoon you can only half remember as an adult. Or maybe it's all four. Why limit yourself to just one beloved childhood gaming experience? We all have games that stick out in our memories, and for me, one of those games is Lemmings. Watching those gormless little sods aimlessly meander around with zero self-preservation skills was enjoyable, but not as enjoyable as successfully getting them into the goal. Once upon a time, this game was everywhere, but now the game is all but forgotten, a relic that occasionally resurfaces on Sony's stable of consoles, but seldom makes a big splash.
Why is that? Well, there's a simple one-word answer, and there's a longer, wordier answer. So strap yourselves in, because we are going to dive headfirst into, the longer one, the wordier one. This is Sony's Lemmings problem.
Lemmings is a puzzle game with a simple goal. Use the limited abilities given to you at the start of each level to issue commands to individual lemmings and get as many of them as you possibly can to the exit, or at least enough to meet the level's minimum requirement. Simple to learn, challenging to master, nigh on impossible to complete, but at age 5, I poured myself into this game. I spent hours with it, I dreamt about it, I wrote stories about it. On Monday morning at school, when we'd have to present what we did over the weekend, I'd become accustomed to the collective groans of my class as I told them, once again, about an entire weekend spent shepherding these adorable little idiots towards freedom. Admittedly, I wasn't playing it properly. We had a less than legitimate copy that opened with a cheat menu, a trainer, as they were called back in the day, added by the team that had pirated the game, that gave me an unlimited quantity of each of the game's abilities. And when I finally completed the game with the difficulty and handicap removed, I was presented not with a congratulations screen, but with a glitching, screaming howl of corrupted sound files and mangled sprites set against a magenta background.
Which, not gonna lie, is the scariest thing a video game has ever shown me. No, actually, no, sorry. I'm just now remembering the melting alien baby from Darkseid, which is actually the scariest thing that a video game has ever shown me. Sorry, I'd managed to repress it, and now it's like it's right here in my in my head.
For Christmas one year, my grandmother got me a copy of the game's sequel, Lemmings 2: The Tribes, and though it was great to revisit the premise, this game never really quite clicked with me in the same way. Too many abilities, too little variation in the level design, and it took me far too long to realise that the number of lemmings you rescued carried over to the next level, which, I'm an idiot. There's no other way around it. I never finished this one, legitimately or otherwise, and I don't come back to it as frequently as I do the original, but it's still an important game to me, coming from a very particular time in my childhood. Turns out Lemmings was special to a lot of people. The original game sold more than 55,000 copies on its first day of release, topping even the lifetime sales of some of Psygnosis's other titles from the time, and went on to sell millions more, eventually finding itself ported to a number of platforms, home computers, home consoles, over the following decade and a half. The original game has an estimated total sales in excess of 15 million copies worldwide. It appealed not just to the sort of people who liked point-and-click adventures and mindless arcade shoot-'em-ups, but also the sort of person who saw their computer as a spreadsheet engine, as a tool. People who typically don't play games, an audience not too dissimilar from the people who saw this back in 2006 and were immediately captivated. The sort of person that a certain snooty up-themselves type of gamer might refer to as casual. Casual gamers are scum. Hang on. There's some chocolate on my script. Casual gamers are some of the best of us. While some of us are knee-deep in the latest AAA releases or arguing over whether a canonically lesbian character in a video game should be allowed to kiss another girl in the trailer, casual gamers are playing simpler games on their PCs and freemium titles on their smartphones, tablets, and Amazon Hoobagoobers, and they are having a great time doing it. We can argue over the latest changes to Fortnite all we want, we can bicker over whether or not an armor-plated killing machine piloted by an enthusiastic hamster is thematically appropriate for Overwatch until the cows come home, but there are millions and millions of people quietly and happily getting on with playing games like Threes, Monument Valley, and, well, not this, nobody's playing this anymore, but there are no shortage of slidey gem games like this one, which I've singled out for fairly obvious reasons. What's more, with AAA titles becoming more and more expensive to produce, the amount of money studios stand to make from them is limited. A lot of work for very little payoff, with the obvious exception of Grand Theft Auto 5, which has made, let's see here, holy crap, $6 billion? Holy shit!
Sorry, don't mind me, I'm just, applying for jobs at Rockstar. What's pegging? I can work it out on the job.
Casual games are still big business, and they're often able to attract people who might not otherwise play games at all. What's more, these are the games that become household titles in the 21st century. Angry Birds might not be as popular as it was when it launched in 2010, but the Angry Birds movie remains the second highest grossing video game movie of all time. Candy Crush was one of 2 games to be featured in the hot mess that was the Emoji Movie, with the other being the equally accessible and easy to understand Just Dance, although Just Dance doesn't work like this. This is not how this is. Yeah, can we stop this now, please? Can we get this off the okay, thank you very much. Lemmings never quite achieved that level of ubiquity. I mean, it influenced the events of a Terry Pratchett novel, but it didn't have the wider cultural impact of other games of the era may have had. But it was popular with gamers and non-gamers alike, spawning imitators such as Blobs, a rather uninspired knockoff that dropped for the Amiga in 1996, and Pingoos, a Linux game, one of a half dozen or so attempts to draw people over to Linux as a gaming platform by taking something that already existed and turning it into the sort of thing only a Linux player would want to play in the first place. There were, of course, follow-ups and sequels to Lemmings, including Oh No More Lemmings, a sort of Lost Levels style standalone expansion with a markedly higher difficulty curve than the original. This was followed by a full sequel, the aforementioned Lemmings to the Tribes, which was critically acclaimed, and All New World of Lemmings, which wasn't. This game was released in the US as the Lemmings Chronicles and marked the beginning of the end for the franchise. It didn't sell very well, and it's largely forgotten by all but the most ardent fans of the series. There were more follow-ups, of course, including 3D Lemmings, which is only marginally less successful, a 3D transition than the one Bubsy made around the same time, and Lemmings Revolution, which takes an interesting and novel approach to the Lemmings formula by having the levels exist on a looped, rotating pillar, but then ruins it by making the game utterly devoid of even the slightest hint of charm. After this, Lemmings sort of quietly vanished. Ports continued to pop up for systems like the PS1, where it shone, and the Game Boy Color, where it chugged, spluttered, and stalled like a Citroen 2CV attempting an uphill climb. Eesh. This was the last version of the game of any Lemmings game to be released for anything other than a Sony-branded console.
Why? Well, because Psygnosis, who own the rights to Lemmings, were bought by Sony in 1993, a year ahead of the launch of the original Sony PlayStation. And after letting other developers and publishers license the Lemmings brand in the latter half of the 90s, they let the franchise lie dormant for a few years before eventually deciding to revive it in 2006 with a brand spanking new remake exclusively for the PSP. I know.
The PSP port, knocked out for Sony by Worms developers Team 17, is a largely faithful recreation of the original, albeit with pre-rendered 3D maps and disappointingly stiff animations lacking the fluidity, charm, and character of the original. But despite this, despite the lack of bells and whistles, it was still fairly enjoyable. I had a lot of fun with it. The problem, of course, was that no bugger could play it. By the time the game was released, the PSP had only sold about 10 million units compared to the 26 million that its competitor, the Nintendo DS, had sold. Game sales aggregate VG charts puts the lifetime sales of the PSP version at 860,000 copies. And though VG charts is only slightly less dishonest than your average British tabloid, that's still pretty damning by today's standards. An updated port with a bolted-on iToy mode developed by the whimsically named Rusty Nuts Studios was put out the following year, making the game more accessible, but still limiting the game to a console audience. Since then, we've had 2 more Lemmings titles, a PS3 game which borrows some ideas from All New World of Lemmings and was about as popular, and Lemmings Touch, a version perfectly designed for touchscreens, but that is largely ruined by having appeared solely on the PlayStation Vita.
By the way, despite what Wikipedia says, these are not ports or remakes of the 2006 Lemmings. They are their own games in their own right. Yes, there are some recycled levels, but other than that, new features, new settings, it's a new game. Really, they deserve their own separate Wikipedia entry. So, hop to it, internet, make it happen.
Putting Lemmings onto the Vita and onto the PSP before that is smart. It's a smart play. These are casual games and so would thrive in a portable setting, but it's a decision that's mired somewhat by the fact that neither system sold particularly well, especially by the time the Vita rolled around and there were already, better mobile platforms they could have put the game onto. At some point in the last 20 years, Sony decided that Lemmings was a valuable enough brand that keeping it chained to the PlayStation was a smarter move than allowing it to exist on other platforms, but that has let it stagnate to the point where the only people who remember it are those of us who were playing it the first time around 27 years ago. Lemmings was not a strong enough pull to get people buying either of Sony's handheld offerings, but perhaps it would have fared better on the Nintendo DS, which already had a touchscreen interface and more than 2.5 times as many consoles in the hands of gamers. Sure, it would have been Sony handing something to one of its competitors, but it might have sold better, and that's putting money into their own pocket. It wouldn't even be the first time they'd done that either. 3D Lemmings was put out for the Sega Saturn at the same time as it was put out for the PlayStation, and Psygnosis even put out a version of Wipeout for the Nintendo 64, half a decade after they were bought by Sony. Putting out a new game for their own touchscreen handheld is a little better, but again, who owns a Vita? Who among you has even seen one in the wild? In 2018, there is one really obvious place that Lemmings belongs. But it hasn't happened. Not officially, at least.
Smartphones are an obvious place to put Lemmings. Like the Vita, they're small, they're portable, they fit in your pocket, they have touchscreens, but the advantage they have over the Vita is that people actually own them. Everyone has a smartphone these days, and that's not dissimilar from the shape of the home computer market circa 1991 when the original Lemmings came out. Everyone had a PC or a Mac or an Amiga, something that they could play this game on, and the game became almost mimetic in its popularity.
By trapping Lemmings on their own systems, they're limiting their audience to people who are likely to buy a PS2 or a PS3, or worse, the type of person who thinks the PlayStation Vita was a sound investment. You limit yourself to the sort of audience who is already going to buy games, specifically the sort of person who's going to buy games like Killzone and God of War, which are not bad games. Those are not bad games to enjoy, but that's an audience that Sony have cultivated by putting games like that attract that particular side of audience at the forefront of their marketing and sales strategy. Not the most likely bunch of people to pick up and play a Lemmings game. I can rip into Angry Birds every day for the rest of my life, but the people who play these games en masse weren't going out and buying it for the PlayStation or the Xbox, just as the bulk of people who became addicted to Plants vs. Zombies weren't finding it for the first time on Xbox Live Arcade, which makes this a gently baffling concept. I mean, who is this for?
My stepmom loves Plants vs. Zombies, but somehow I can't picture her picking up a controller and jumping into this game anytime soon.
Lemmings has been forgotten. I remember it, and if you're watching this, chances are you remember it too. But because Sony have tried to position it as something you can only play on a PlayStation console, a game to sit on the shelf next to your Jak and Daxters and your Uncharteds and whatnot, it's been all but scrubbed from the general public consciousness. Fortunately, there's a way to remedy that. Step 1 is, of course, make a new Lemmings game. This is obvious, but what's perhaps less obvious is the route it should take. Keep it simple. Do away with the multitudes of power-ups from Lemmings 2 and the collectible power-ups from the PS3 game, and scrap the Lemmings saved carry over to the next level concept. It's interesting, but if we're starting over, it's too much. Get rid of it. Stick to the basics. The original 8 skills, the minimum required Lemmings to rescue, the countdown timer. Simplicity is what drew people, gamers and otherwise, to this game in the first place. So strip out all of the extraneous guff. Step 3, keep it cute and fluid. As much as I enjoy Team 17's stab at the series, the characters move in a very stiff manner. They're flat sprites, bolted at the joins, lacking the fluidity and simplicity of the originals, and that's a big part of what draws people into these characters, that makes people want to rescue them. They're endearing, they're cute, they have personality. If I were in charge of a new Lemmings game, and I'm not because my industry experience is basically limited to sending emails to Harmonix asking them to expand the Rock Band 4 library with songs by British pop rock band The Feeling, I'd go with traditionally animated cartoon sprites, not that dissimilar from what Team 17 did with the second generation Worms games like Worms Armageddon. Step 4 is such an obvious one that it didn't even occur to me that I should mention it in this stage of the episode, and I'm actually adding it pretty late into the editing stage, though maybe the fact that Sony aren't doing it is evidence that it's not as obvious as I thought. So here it is again. Give it a wider release. Making it a PlayStation exclusive clearly isn't working. It's not a big enough pull as an exclusive. But Lemmings is exactly the sort of game people like to play on the bus, train, tube, or on their lunch breaks. The sheer quantity of remakes, clones, and unlicensed knockoffs floating around on digital storefronts just goes to show how much demand there is for a game just like Lemmings on smartphones. It's got that perfect just one more level factor that makes the best smartphone games so compelling. So just do it! Get this right. And not only does Lemmings become a cultural phenomenon again, but Sony has a potentially new revenue stream. Yes, I know, this sucks, we're talking about money, but sometimes to make something happen, you've got to appeal to the bean counters, and Lemmings is a franchise with a history of making those people very happy. Put out the base game, keep it nice and cheap, and if it does well, hey, level packs. That's basically what Oh No More Lemmings and Holiday Lemmings were anyway, so why not lean into that? Knock it out, keep it cheap, sell level packs, make some money, and make quite a lot of people very, very happy.
Look, I'm not saying this would definitely work, but hey, it's worth a shot. By keeping Lemmings attached to Sony-branded consoles, they are keeping the game away from potentially millions of people who could be playing the game right now, who could be buying the game right now, who could be buying additional content for the game right now. Keeping the game trapped on PlayStation consoles hasn't done the franchise any favors over the last 12 years. Certainly hasn't done the PlayStation any favors over the last 12 years. Lemmings used to be a cultural phenomenon. Yes, alright, it was for like a hot minute in the early 90s, but it could be that again. All Sony needs is a willingness to unshackle Lemmings from the PlayStation and embrace the casual market. That is where the Lemmings money is.
This episode took a little longer to do, so I apologise for the delay, but it's up now and I hope you have enjoyed it. Of course, if you did enjoy it, do feel free to like and share it, and why not subscribe? Hit the whole YouTube trifecta. Also, there's a bell you can ring. You get more shows like Deep Dive, Movies with Mikey, and whatever else we've got in the pipeline. Huge thank you, by the way, to Friz Frizzle, Henry Kropf, and Michelle Osorio for providing footage for this particular episode. I will be back in a couple of weeks with another episode. No idea what it's going to be about, but until then, enjoy life, be happy.